Latinos for Trump. So they believe that the newly elected president's deportation laws are not going to affect them because they are US citizens. So what I'm going to do is teach you guys about how being a US citizen and Latino has not mattered when it comes to being deported, especially if you have a darker shade of skin. During the Great Depression, money was low, there were no jobs, so the European Americans needed someone to blame. So they blamed Mexicans for stealing their jobs. During the 1930s, Republican President Herbert Hoover began the repatriation drive. These quote-unquote drives were pretty much deportation raids. In Los Angeles, the LA Welfare Department started deporting hospital patients, people with tuberculosis, paralysis, mental illnesses, and some simply just because they were old. One woman with leprosy was taken to Mexicali and just dumped over the border. The drives were carried out throughout the U.S. About 2 million people were deported at this time, and more than half of them, about 60% of them, were U.S. citizens. In 1931, a raid on La Placita Olvera rounded up more than 400 people. All of them were sent to Mexico. Herbert Hoover had a slogan during this time period. The slogan was, "American jobs for real Americans." Laws were passed that prevented Mexican Americans from getting any jobs. Agreements were made so that they could not get any government jobs. Agreements were struck so that Ford, U.S. Steel, and the Southern Pacific Railroad all laid off Mexican Americans. Hoover also did something else. He raised import tariffs. Sounds oddly familiar. That did not help the U.S. economy at all. In fact, it prolonged the Great Depression. Let's fast forward to World War II. The Bracero program would be implemented during the 1940s because the U.S. was in the middle of a war and they needed cheap labor. So after deporting millions of Mexicans, they said, hey, we actually kind of need you guys, come back. So about 4.6 million Mexicans either entered or re-entered the U.S. as part of the Bracero program. The Bracero program allowed Mexicans to legally work in the U.S., except in Texas. So what happened was that the Mexican government, as part of the agreement with the U.S., decided that Mexicans were not allowed to work in Texas because of all of the discrimination that Mexicans have suffered in Texas. So Mexicans could work all throughout the U.S. except for Texas. Well, at least for about 5 years. So from 1942 to 1947, no Mexican immigrant was allowed to work in Texas, per the Mexican government's rules. But do you think that stopped Texas companies from employing undocumented workers, undocumented Mexican workers? Nope. It was illegal to employ undocumented workers. But the Texans, they did so anyway because they wanted to take advantage of the cheap labor. After World War II was over, Operation Wetback began. So after the U.S. government invited us back to come and work and say, hey, we need you guys, now that they no longer needed us, they said, you know what? You guys need to go. As many as 1.3 million people were deported to Mexico under Operation Wetback. Operation Wetback was implemented by another Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. 3 planes a week were flown out of Chicago, and Texas would deport people on ships that were described as slave ships.